9:05 it is, and it's ready to go. So this morning we are very pleased to introduce a all-female ENS team to you. It's a powerhouse this morning. The ENS team, of course, is here this morning to chat with us around navigating the Disaster Management Act regulations, which has come at us quite quickly and which has caught businesses unawares. I will leave it to Lydia to introduce the team. As I've said, we will have the chat open at all times, so please feel free to put your thoughts and ideas into the chat, and we will keep an eye on those while our panelists take us through the presentation. Over to you, Lydia.
Thank you, Mel. Good morning, all. Welcome to this joint venture webinar with ENS Africa and SAVCA. Thank you for your time and your attention this morning on the 5th day of lockdown as a result of one of the most devastating pandemics we will face as humanity. On 15 March 2020, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, designated under Section 3 of the Disaster Management Act and in terms of subsection 27(2)(a), declared a national state of disaster. On 17 March 2020, the Minister made regulations in consultation with Cabinet regarding the necessary steps to prevent an escalation of the disaster or to alleviate, contain, and minimize the effects of the disaster. We will refer to these as the lockdown regulations. In facing our new reality, we as ENS Africa have been applying our minds as to how best we can help our clients and our community. And one of the solutions we came up with together with SAVCA was this webinar. That is to put our skills into helping you better understand the regulations applicable to the lockdown period. We know that a number of you joining us today have portfolio companies that you need to guide through this difficult time, and we hope that our presentation this morning will be very useful to you, as these lockdown regulations impact us all personally, professionally, and in business. Presenting to you today is Pippa Reyburn, Altair, and myself, Lydia Shadrach-Razzino. We're all senior directors in the corporate commercial department at ENS Africa. Pippa and Altair are going to take you through the lockdown regulations and essential services as they will impact you and your portfolio companies. And I will talk you through very briefly lease arrangements that will also impact you. I'm now going to hand over to Pippa and thereafter Altair.
Thanks, Lydia. Can we have the first slide? Thanks. So I'm just going to take you through the sort of overarching regulatory framework and the steps that have been taken so far, leading us up to the essential goods and services regulations, and then Altair will take you through those in more detail. So just to look at the framework, it's all happened, this whole process, under the Disaster Management Act, which establishes a National Disaster Management Center and allows the head of that center to classify a disaster, and disaster is defined in that act as national, provincial, or local. And only once that classification has been made by the head of the center does that determine which sphere of government has primary responsibility for coordinating and managing the disaster, and that classification triggers an entitlement on the part of the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs to declare a disaster. And there are two preconditions which must, or two alternative preconditions which must exist in order for the Minister to be able to declare a disaster. The one is where existing legislation and contingency arrangements don't adequately provide for the National Executive to deal with the disaster. And the other is where special circumstances warrant it. So that process was triggered. And just to mention that a national disaster must be distinguished from a state of emergency, which is a different procedure which hopefully will not need to be triggered and which is provided for in the Constitution and requires an act of Parliament to give effect to the measures that would be taken into when a state of emergency is declared. So COVID-19 was classified and declared as a national disaster on the 15th of March. Moving on to the next slide. So this whole process commenced with the President's first announcement on national television on the 15th of March. And that was the same day that both the classification and the declaration happened. The first set of general regulations was published on the 18th, and those provided for the first phase of the disaster, so pre-lockdown. So the impact of those was to permit the release of state resources and personnel to fight the virus, and that included shifting around funding within existing budgets, but not new funding. It also provided for the closure of schools and care facilities and a suspension of visits to prisons and other similar facilities. It made provision for the initial prohibition on gatherings of over 100 people or 50 in restaurants and bars. It also limited the sale of alcohol after hours and in restaurants in the evenings. And then it provided for mandatory submission to medical treatment, examination, and potentially quarantine and isolation for persons who have COVID-19 or are suspected to have it, or who've been in contact with someone who has it. And it provided a procedure whereby they could be essentially arrested if they refused to do any of those things. The last thing, which is has become very important, is that the first set of regulations also authorized various other ministers, which it named in that first set of regulations, to issue and vary directions within their mandates. So it provided for a number of specific authorizations to ministers to issue directions. And then it also provided for a general authorization to all ministers to be able to issue directions within their areas to help manage the virus and the pandemic impacts. Okay, next slide. So subsequent to that first set of directions, there was obviously the President's second announcement of the national lockdown and proposed stimulus measures. And those initial 18 March regulations were then amended to give effect to the lockdown. That happened on the 25th of March, and they have been amended once since then on the 26th of March. And Altair may take you through some of those amendments. Then there have also been a number of consequential directions, directives, exemptions, instructions, and numerous other instruments, legal instruments, issued to mitigate the impact of the national disaster. And I've just listed a few of those here. They include block exemptions under the Competition Act, regulations for consumer protection, directions issued by the Minister of Public Service and Administration on which are essential government services, the rules of the Temporary Employee Relief Scheme, also a Treasury instruction on emergency procurement by organs of state, and then various other directions, for example, on home affairs matters, transportation, border control, air services, and some export control regulations. And there are more of these being issued every day. And I think from a legal perspective, there are a couple of important things about this whole process. One of them is that the Disaster Management Act doesn't override other legislation. So it doesn't allow for ministers to make regulations or directions that supersede other laws. So they have to fit in with other laws or apply the other laws if they want to grant exemptions or exceptions for this period. And then the other thing is that there's no particular format specified for directions issued in terms of this Disaster Management Act. And I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to work out exactly what the status of some of these instruments are, and whether, for example, we had an example yesterday where there was a media statement issued on the letterhead of a ministry, and the question was, does that amount to a direction, or is that something of a lesser status which is not binding? So those kind of questions are coming up more and more often, and I think that is a risk area that we think might become increasingly difficult to navigate. Okay, I'll hand over to Altair to talk about the essential services aspects of those new regulations.
Thank you, Pippa. Pippa has sort of set out the framework, and now we'll go into a bit more detail on the essential goods and services lockdown regulations. And I think, as Lydia mentioned in her opening statement, I mean, I'm not aware of any laws that, have impacted so broadly, in both the personal sphere, as well as the professional and business sphere. And all of this is part of a weighing up process between, the economic effects of a lockdown are obviously extremely severe. But it's weighing that up against the potential suffering and loss of human life. And it's interesting in drawing parallels between South Africa and what other jurisdictions have decided to do. And I think it's quite clear that South Africa took a view to impose a lockdown very early on in terms of the progression of the spread of COVID-19 in South Africa. And time will tell if that was the right decision to make or not the right decision, viewing economics and social issues and health holistically. But I think internally we've come to, or my personal view, let me put it that way, I won't put it on anyone else, is that it was the right decision. It's a very, very hard decision. It's unclear what the ultimate impact will be. But I'm not sure that we had any other choice based on the state of our healthcare system and the capacity that we have. So going through this in some detail, and some of this obviously you'll be aware of, but because there have been 2 sets of amendments to these regulations already, the most recent having been very late on Thursday, the 26th, I will go through the general provisions. And then, obviously, if there's a specific area of interest, we can we'll have questions afterwards. So, for the period of the lockdown, every person is confined to his or her place of residence, unless strictly for the purpose of performing an essential service, obtaining an essential good or service, collecting a social grant, or seeking emergency, life-saving, or chronic medical attention. You'll notice that, unlike, for instance, the UK, there's not an exception to allow you, for instance, to tend to vulnerable people. It seems like government has said they're going to take that responsibility on themselves with NGOs. But if you are an older person who is infirm and unable to go to buy food for yourself, it's not immediately clear to us, what sort of mechanics are in place to ensure that the elderly and vulnerable are attended to in terms of their daily needs during this lockdown. It's also raised questions, that are sort of of less real import, but there's sort of differing views on, if you're confined to your place of residence, does that mean you can, for instance, still use the common area in a sectional title unit, or that if you live on an estate, you can still walk on the roads that are not private roads? That are not public roads, because as you see also, unlike some other jurisdictions, there's no exception for exercise, for leaving your house for exercise. But those are day-to-day issues, but less concerning than many of the other issues. In terms of Regulation 11B1B, during the lockdown, all businesses and other entities shall cease operations except for any business or entity involved in the manufacturing, supply, or provision of an essential good or service, save where operations are provided from outside the Republic or can be provided remotely by a person from their normal place of residence. The last wording, the last sort of 2.5 lines there were added by those most recent amendments on the 26th. So that makes, you know, whatever you might do remotely or what we do remotely permissible during this lockdown period. And retail shops and shopping malls must be closed except where essential goods are sold. And then there's the imposition of conditions that are that social distancing must be complied with. And as a retailer, if you are selling essential good, you must ensure that those safety measures are in place. As you probably would have seen, in areas of higher population density, even for a number of days after the imposition of the lockdown, you know, the army has been brought in to try to keep social distancing in place with differing levels of success. And there's already been a number of complaints to IPID in relation to the conduct of the police, and also in relation to there's been complaints in relation to the conduct of the army thus far, and that they've been heavy-handed in trying to impose these conditions. If we could move to the next slide. So interestingly, and again, unlike in a number of other jurisdictions, retail stores that do sell essential goods are prohibited from selling any other goods. So you may have gotten your email from Clicks telling you they're not selling perfume anymore and colored makeup, and there's a number of, you know, of issues, but that's a prohibition that I think is a little bit unusual that we have in South Africa compared to other jurisdictions. In terms of Regulation 11B2, the head of an institution, which is basically like the CEO or the MD, must determine the essential services to be performed by his or her institution and must determine the essential staff who will perform those services. So in many states, although it's perhaps not as clear as it could be in these lockdown regulations, certainly in terms of statements that have been made by ministers, is that even if you are an essential service provider, it's not business as usual. You have to, you know, you have to only, you know, keep working the minimum number of staff that are required really to provide that essential service, and it's not, yeah, it's not that the second you're an essential service, it's completely business as usual. All borders of the Republic are closed during the period of lockdown except for transportation of fuel and essential goods. And any person who contravenes Regulation 11.1b, which is the lockdown to your residence, shall be guilty of an offence and on conviction liable to a fine of not more than 20,000 Rand or to imprisonment for a period not exceeding 6 months or to both. Next slide. So essential goods means the goods referred to in paragraph A of Annexure B as amended from time to time. And what there's basically 5 categories of essential goods: foods, cleaning and hygiene, medical, fuel, and basic goods. And it also includes the supply chain, which is all the chemicals, packaging, and ancillary products used in the production of any food product. And food product includes non-alcoholic beverages, but it's clear that the position is that alcoholic beverages are not to be sold during the lockdown or produced. Next slide. I won't go into all the detail here, but I will say that on the 26th, what was the 2 categories that were added under the cleaning and hygiene essential goods and services were products for the care of babies and toddlers, personal toiletries, including hair care, body and face washes, roll-ons, deodorants, and toothpaste. What we've also heard in terms of our clients' interactions with government during this time is that they see this as a work in progress, so there will probably be further amendments to these regulations. Some things, you know, were omitted because this was all done, you know, quite quickly, and so they're sort of also learning as they go along in this process, and these lists of essential goods and services may be further tweaked. Next slide. And there's also medical and hospital supplies, equipment and personal protective equipment, chemicals, packaging, and ancillary products. It's interesting, there was, in terms of the sort of Business South Africa and Business Leadership South Africa sort of joint COVID-19 project. You might have seen kind of an appeal go out yesterday to businesses that may be closed during the lockdown to divert any personal protective equipment they may have to the healthcare sector. So obviously, from an occupational health and safety perspective and in the mining context, there's a lot of personal protective equipment that's out there that may be not in use currently by other industries that are not an essential good or service. Fuel is also an essential good, and basic goods, including airtime and electricity. An interesting one there is that the thinking currently, and it's on the ground, the position that's been taken is that the sale of cigarettes is prohibited. Apparently, it was in terms of news reports, this is being re-looked at, and as you can see, if you think from a policy perspective, why is there no sale of alcohol and no sale of cigarettes during this period? Well, for alcohol, I mean, you could see that perhaps linked into domestic violence or violence against women. My personal view is with cigarettes that yes, although they harm your lungs and possibly there's some evidence out there that if you are a smoker, it puts you at higher risk for having more serious effects from COVID-19. But on the other hand, if you have, having been a former smoker myself, I can imagine having thousands and thousands of people not having access to their nicotine. I can't imagine that could have a positive effect on violence or theft or robbery and that type of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because apparently it's being re-looked at by government as to whether that prohibition will remain on cigarettes. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read this all out, but basically, as you're probably aware, under the Labor Relations Act, certain services or industries can be designated as essential services. And I'm not a labor lawyer, but I think the bottom line is if you are designated as an essential service, you actually don't have the same rights to strike. So those categories still apply as essential services for purposes of these regulations. And then there's a lot of overlap. They've also fleshed out essential services in Annexure B to the regulations. They include also the production and sale of essential goods, grocery stores, including spaza shops, electricity, medical health, including mental health, laboratory and medical services, and ICDs, operations, disaster management, fire prevention, and then also financial services necessary to maintain the functioning of the banking and payments environment, including the JSE, as well as insurance services and medical scheme administration. Next slide. There's a whole additional long list. What I will just read to you is actually, I think on the next slide, will be the ones that were added on the 26th. And the ones that were added were, and again, these are things where it probably only came to the realization after these issues were raised by Business Unity South Africa or by other industry bodies, that they were excluded by oversight and should be included. So these were included last Thursday, are tow trucks and vehicle recovery services, call centers necessary to provide health, safety, social support, government and financial services, harvesting and storage activities essential to prevent wastage of primary agricultural goods, implementation of payroll systems to the extent these weren't already in place before the lockdown, and critical maintenance services which cannot be delayed for more than 21 days and are essential to resume operations after the lockdown. There's also a provision in the regulations that was added late last Thursday in relation to care and maintenance. Keeping in mind that even for non-essential services or producers of people who are not producing essential goods, there may be situations where in order to protect that business, you need to do some actions during the lockdown. So this new regulation states that all workplaces or premises must have care and maintenance that is essential to the prevention of the destruction or significant impairment of working areas, plant, machinery, or inventory, and to permit orderly shutdown arrangements on such conditions as may be issued by means of directions by the cabinet ministers responsible for trade and industry and employment and labor. I'm not aware of any such conditions having been issued as yet, but those may come in the following days. Okay, next slide. So then we get to the Annexure D of the regulations, which sets out places and premises closed to the public. And it actually creates an offense, another offense, if you contravene those regulations. I mean, I think we can go to the next slide. So these are the list. So obviously, any place or premises normally open to the public where religious, cultural, sporting, entertainment, etc. activities take place. Any place or premises where goods other than essential goods are procured, acquired, disposed of, or sold. Public parks, flea markets, open food markets. And for the avoidance of doubt, on last Thursday, restaurants were added to that list because there was some ambiguity as to whether restaurants, because they do produce and sell an essential good, being foodstuffs. But that loophole or that lack of clarity was rectified last Thursday. Still, where there is some ambiguity is in relation to, for instance, butcheries and bakeries. We did see the other day, on the first day of the lockdown, in the early hours of the morning, the police had closed down a bakery, but it's not clear in terms of the regulations if that's correct or not. Some of the big supermarket chains have decided to close their bakery operations. Other petrol stations that have convenience stores and mini bakeries have decided to keep those open. Some have decided to close. So there still is, there still is some lack of clarity on some of these issues. And obviously nightclubs, casinos, bazaars, hotels, lodges, and guest houses, except to the extent that they were required for remaining tourists confined to hotels, lodges, and guest houses. Because also in terms of the regulations, any foreigner who had entered the Republic after a certain date is required to stay in their place of residence, which could be a hotel or guest house. And I think that's me handing over. Oh no, there's the whole list goes on. I won't go into the detail here, other than obviously all places that alcohol are sold, including supermarkets, they cannot carry out those activities during the lockdown. And other places or premises may be added from time to time by the cont minister in the Gazette. I'll hand over to Lydia.
Thanks, Pippa. Thanks, Altair. So I'm going to quickly talk about lease arrangements. So in terms of regulation 11 Cap B 1B, as Altair has already chatted about, all businesses and other entities shall cease operations except where they manufacture, provide, or supply an essential good or service. So this means that unless you're providing an essential good or service, you need to be closed. And this raises the question as to whether or not tenants then are legally required to continue to pay rent during the lockdown period. So most lease agreements should have a clause which deals with force majeure, and if you do have that sort of clause in a lease agreement, you need to go and look at it quite carefully and see what it tells you as to how to deal with force majeure, because this sort of lockdown that is imposed in terms of the regulations would constitute a force majeure event, which has been, and that Latin term has now been on the lips of many people, and it essentially means that the circumstances have arisen that make it impossible for someone to perform in terms of a contractual obligation. So if your lease agreement is silent on force majeure, what you would then look to is the common law. And in terms of the common law, a lessor or landlord is obliged to give to a lessee or tenant undisturbed use and enjoyment of the premises. And to the extent that a lessor is prevented from doing so, so it becomes impossible for him to do so, and that would be in the situation that we currently find ourselves, he is relieved of that obligation, but so is the tenant then relieved of its corresponding obligation to pay rent for that period. And what you would need to do is you would need to claim a remission of your rental for that lockdown period. But we would just like to make it clear that tenants being deprived of use and enjoyment of the premises, as it's impossible for a lessor to give undisturbed use of the premises to the tenant, must be as a direct result of the regulations and not necessarily because of a downturn in the economy. So, for instance, and for example, if you are providing an essential service and you are using the premises that you are leasing, you would still be obliged to pay rental for that portion of the premises that you're using to provide the essential good or service. And even and if you are not, your revenue is dropped as a result of the downturn in the economy, as a result of this disaster, you're not necessarily going to be entitled, or you're not going to be entitled in all likelihood to claim any remission of rental for that purpose. But I'd just like to mention again, please be very careful about looking at the force majeure provisions and other specific provisions of your lease agreements to ensure that you're in compliance with what is contractually contained in those documents. So Mel, that's the end of the presentation, so we can move on to Q&A now.
Fantastic. And first and foremost, thank you very much for that overview, ladies. Very interesting. We've got a couple of questions that have come across our screen, and I want to encourage participants, if you have any other questions, please put your hands up and we'll allow you to ask the panelists your questions directly. While we wait for guys to put their hands up, Jo Marie van Zyl, you had a question around workers being able to strike, workers who have been declared as essential workers or services over this period, their ability to strike. Are any of you able to shed any light on this question? My panelists are all going, they're not labor lawyers.
No, I mean, we can certainly find out and feed back to you, because what I don't know is whether designation as an essential service under the Disaster Management Act and these regulations equates to an essential services for purposes of the Labor Relations Act, but we can find out for you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I have moved off the slides, I apologize. I'll put us back on the slide shortly, but while I do that, there was another question. Everybody would like to know, you know, these regulations are changing so quickly. Where do they find these regulations? Is there one place where they are able to look for the regulations, regularly go for a visit?
So there is the government on the government website, so that's www.gov.za. They've got a link to COVID-19 materials right on the sort of cover page of the website, and it's got quite a good resource there, and there's a sort of link to a section called, I think, Regulations and Directions, and I'm not sure that it's completely comprehensive, but it's a very good place to start. And obviously it also has links to all the individual departments, national government departments. So if you're looking for something in a particular sector, it's worth looking at each departmental website as well. But that government resource is pretty good.
Fantastic. And if everybody's looking for that government resource, it is on the SAVCA website. So please have a look at our COVID-19 resources page and you will find the link to the government website there. I see Tracy Cohen, I see that you've put your hand up and I'm going to allow you to ask your question in a moment. But first, I wanted to get to Barbara Granton's question. And Barbara, you've asked around the panelists providing their views on payment to employees that cannot work during this forced shutdown. Specifically, if you look at it in the context of the Disaster Management Act versus the benefits available via UIF relief and benefits available under the tax exemption regulations that were recently published. Pippa, is that going to be you? Shall I unmute you? There we go. Let's unmute you.
Sure. I think that's difficult. I mean, I'm not a labor lawyer. I have looked at that temporary employee relief scheme. and so that obviously allows employers to claim a certain portion of what would otherwise be payable to employees for the 3-month period. In terms of whether they should continue to pay, you know, I think it's more of an employment law question or a moral question, but I'm afraid I'm not really qualified to comment on that.
Understood. We're getting a lot of tax-related questions coming through on these webinars. So what we will do is definitely have that up for a next webinar. And thank you for that, Tracy. The ENS website does have many good resources on this specifically. And again, I point you to the SAVCA resources website, where we have tried to put all the latest and the greatest information on these types of questions as they come through from the law firms. But for this webinar, please go and visit the ENS website first. Tracy, you had your hand up earlier. I'm not sure if that's still the case because it seems to have gone. Are you still interested in talking to us? If so, put your hand up again. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to other questions. No, I think Tracy doesn't want to talk to us anymore. And thanks for that hint around the ENS website, Tracy. I had a couple of questions, and maybe it's thematically as it's come through on your presentation, ladies. The first one really is for you, Pippa, just to understand what is the difference between a state of disaster and a state of emergency, and what is the likelihood of us moving from a state of disaster to a state of emergency. Altair, the next one is going to be for you. And then we've heard of businesses, at least in the media, that have been prevented from accessing their business premises, or the employees have been prevented from coming through to work, even though they have been issued with a certificate of exemption from the CIPC as an essential service, and or those employees have been issued with the relevant letter of exemption. What can these businesses do? Where can they go for assistance? And then Lydia, I had a question for you. Is this the last of it? How much more regulation are we going to see, refinement over the period of the lockdown? And I guess I asked the question because we have seen a lot of loose interpretation around the regulations, certainly by some law enforcement and government departments. So is this the last of it, or do you see government over the period of this lockdown engaging in more regulation? So Pippa, you were first up. Go for it.
Okay, so in the state of emergency is something that's provided for in the Constitution itself, and it's in the Bill of Rights. And the reason for that is because the declaration of a state of emergency allows Parliament to limit rights in a way that it would not normally be able to. So, but the preconditions for a state of emergency are a lot more onerous than those for a state of disaster. And so what the Constitution says is that a state of emergency may only be declared in terms of an act of Parliament. So Parliament would have to pass a law to declare a state of emergency, and only when the life of the nation is threatened by war, invasion, general insurrection, disorder, natural disaster, or other public emergency. That's the first precondition. And then the second one is that the declaration is necessary to restore peace and order. So I think the general view is that with something like the virus, it wouldn't be appropriate to declare a state of emergency unless the lockdown or people's reactions to the lockdown turn into a state of kind of general protest and chaos, such that a state of emergency would have to be declared. So I think we're not there yet, and hopefully we will never get to that point, because it would mean a kind of dramatic escalation of adverse reaction to the national disaster regulations, I think, to get us to a point where a state of emergency would be even thinkable.
Thank you for that clarity. Altair.
Thank you. So I think the question that you've asked actually puts its finger on one of the big issues that we've been facing in advising clients, is that it's one thing to, where there's ambiguity, to find different interpretations of the regulations in terms of what is an essential good or what is an essential service, and obviously many other provisions as well. But the problem is at the end of the day, if the police and the army are being told to enforce in a different way, then it's not going to be helpful that you have an ENS legal opinion on you, when they lock up your premises. So I mean, we've actually probably, I would say, we've been advising clients quite conservatively on these regulations, not least of which just because of the underlying purpose of these regulations, which obviously is to protect and try to save lives. So I mean, I think that so that's sort of a general comment. And then going back to your specific comment, in terms of the regulations, as long as a person does have a permit that's been signed by the head of their institution, and it has a stamp or seal or what have you, they should be permitted to travel by the police or by the army. The CIPC certificate is an interesting one because it's actually not a compulsory requirement. The Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister Patel, clarified that that's something voluntary, and obviously it can serve sort of an evidentiary purpose. For instance, if you want to export an essential good and the counterpart in another jurisdiction requires a sort of a formal, some kind of formal designation of you as an essential service provider. But the first thing is why I think that CIPC process is voluntary and not mandatory is that it obviously links in to the information that the CIPC already has at its disposal and can pre-populate the certificate, for instance. But what that doesn't cover is essential service providers that may be sole proprietorships or a partnership or a business trust. They would never be able to, or as the setup currently is on CIPC, they would not be able to obtain such a certificate. In terms of people not accepting, that type of documentation and not allowing people to get into premises, I mean, unfortunately, the only route that you have is really a legal route. I mean, what we've been trying to do behind the scenes in terms of working with association, industry association and broader business associations is to entreat them to encourage ministers and the president to clarify as many things as possible about these regulations. So then there's not a gap between what we believe the regulations mean and what the police and the army are being told from an enforcement perspective. So I think the more clarity that can come from either further clarifying regulations or even just from statements, from the president or from ministers clarifying certain aspects of the regulations, so we all, so business knows what to expect, and that the police and army also are on the same page. So it's difficult because clearly there's a gap between what on the face of it the regulations mean and how this is being interpreted by enforcement agencies.
Thank you for that, Altair. Before I move on to you, Lydia, I see there's 2 questions in the Q&A box. Please can you place them in the chat webinar instead, and we'll get to them shortly. Lydia, yours.
Thanks, Mel. So your question was, do we anticipate any more sort of amendments or rectifications to the regulations? So I think the quick answer to that is yes, but this is uncharted waters for us all. This is all very new. And the regulations were done in a very short period of time, and I personally think that it was a good job in a very short space of time. But they're not perfect. And there have already been, like we've heard Pippa and Altair talk us through it, from the first set that was initially published, there have already been amendments to that. And we actually participated in lobbying for some of those amendments, because one of our clients has a towing company, and that wasn't on the list of essential services, and we helped them to get that onto the list of essential services for obvious reasons. I mean, if an ambulance transporting someone to hospital in an emergency situation breaks down and you need a tow truck, that you should be able to get that, and you should be able to do that quite quickly. So we definitely do think that there will be more amendments and rectifications to these regulations as we continue during the lockdown period. I think as people are going to be thinking about what constitutes essential services, we might find new things popping up. But I also think people are also going to try and look for loopholes in the regulation. So there will be amendments to close all potential loopholes that we find in the regulation.
Thank you for that, Lydia. And we've seen already that there have been a couple of approaches to the courts, those for good reason and those for not such good reason. I saw there was an NGO that approached the courts yesterday, I think, or the day before, and the courts gave a 3-line response going, no, your application is rejected, with the contempt that it deserves in this instance. I wanted to ask again, are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you see you have the ability to put up your hand. If you put up your hand and you want to ask your question directly, please put it up now, and we'll allow you to ask your question. Otherwise, please post it in the webinar chat box that you should also be able to access, and we'll get the panelists to answer them. This one is for any one of the three who wants to take up the challenge. And thematically speaking, we're into really the first week of lockdown. We've seen the army in our streets. We've seen the South African police services in our streets. And we've seen people starting to test these authorities. I think under the circumstances, we all accept that it is very difficult, given South Africa's socio-economic context, to control the execution of authority by these entities. Do you have a view, or can you let our participants know where they should go or who they can contact in the event that they believe that an authority has gone a step too far, whether it been in the execution of a regulation and or the execution of force in terms of applying a regulation?
I mean, I don't have a full answer. I saw in the news media that there have been a number of complaints made to IPID on police action, and I think that is a channel for those kind of complaints. And I think there is also a general hotline complaint, and certainly within government, and then there probably are a number of NGOs that would be taking complaints on behalf of the public about police or defence force brutality or inappropriate conduct. Certainly we can try and have a look at that and send you a list of resources or something that may be used.
Thank you for taking up the challenge, Pippa, and answering the question. Natalie Loria, you asked a question in the chat box as to the status of court orders as against ministerial directions. Can court orders be overridden at this point in time by, for example, the minister effectively overriding a court order of access and custody by insisting that children remain with one parent? A little bit out of the context of a commercial situation, but I guess relevant from a principle perspective.
Maybe I'll take a stab at that since I'm taking up the challenges. So I think I think I understand that there has been at least one court order to the effect that a child who's subject to a parenting plan or whatever must stay with the parent, the primary custodian, or the parent they were with at the time that the lockdown began. I think in order to look at whether regulations could be issued that override that order, you need to look at the Disaster Management Act and the powers given to the minister to make regulations. And I certainly think that the powers which are in section 27(2) of the Disaster Management Act are wide enough to permit the minister to make regulations regulating movement of children between guardians or parents or custodians during the lockdown, so that if the authorities decided that that court order was too restrictive, especially if the lockdown were to be extended, say for another 3 weeks, which is, I understand currently the the rumor or the talk, then I think certainly that would be lawful for regulations to be made that vary the terms of that court order.
Thank you for clarifying, Pippa. There's a question that's come through from Tanya. Thank you, Tanya, about the lasting effect of these regulations and changes we see now. It's a lot. Is there going to be a lasting implication coming through post the lockdown and this crisis that we are now facing as a result of COVID-19?
Well, I mean, and subject to correction by Pippa, but I mean, all of what we've seen so far is linked in terms of how long these regulations will endure, is linked into you know, the extent that the national disaster, the COVID-19 national disaster is still declared. So the intention is that these will all fall away and life will go back to normal. But sort of from a more philosophical perspective, I mean, it's hard, and this is not a legal view, but it's hard to see that everything will go back to the normal ways of work. I mean, I think the one thing that this has taught us is that jobs that we thought couldn't be done remotely actually can be done remotely. And also, I mean, if you think about that, I was reading an article about, you know, on what basis do, for instance, most different types of companies not employ more disabled people that can, for instance, work from home? I mean, all of this is possible, and the what was holding us back, I think, was just psychology, just our mindset. So, I mean, I think there will be lasting impact on the world after all of these regulations and the virus goes away. It'll be hard to see how the world will be exactly the same after this.
So, sorry, Lydia.
If I can jump in there, just to say that I completely agree with what Altair has just said. I think there's going to be lots of lasting implications as a result of this, and only a crystal ball is going to show us what the world's going to look like once we all come out on the other side of this. And I am an eternal optimist, and I think we will come out well on the other side of this. And I'm personally hoping that we can all hold on to the positive lasting implications and take those forward with us. But I was also reading a very interesting article, I think it was the New York Times last night, where they were speaking about how certain countries have now, as a result of this, used the disaster to claw back on rights given to their citizens. For instance, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of movement. And there's lots of speculation as to whether or not these countries and the heads of these states are going to try and hold on to some of those restrictions on the right of privacy, right to freedom of movement, etc. And like I said, only time's going to tell.
If I can just add to that, can I just have, I think Lydia's made a very important point, and I think one of the legal issues relating to these regulations is that although the Disaster Management Act gives the minister wide powers to regulate movement, communication, etc., any regulations that are made in terms of that act do need to be constitutionally valid from a Bill of Rights perspective, which means limitations on rights must be reasonable, justifiable, etc. in a democratic society. And I think, I think that's always something to keep a watch on, and to make sure that, for example, the kind of personal data that's being shared through the contact tracing mechanisms that are being put in place. And I think the President announced last night in his address some sort of new measure that using mobile technology for contact tracing, and that hasn't yet been fully regulated, but I think we anticipate regulations on that. But I think it is important to keep a check to make sure that data sharing and other kinds of privacy invasions are limited to the disaster and terminated once that ends.
And that's a super important point, Pippa, and thanks Lydia and Altair for your views there as well. We hope that our constitution is strong enough to withstand what might come post COVID-19, if there is such a thing as post COVID-19. Maybe a final question. I'm not seeing any other questions or raised hands, so maybe a final question before I allow you just to close off is, where do you think we're going to be seeing the biggest shifts in legislation post-lockdown? COVID-19 has obviously emphasized certain gaps that we've had in legislation and or associated regulation. Where do you think we're going to see the biggest movement post-COVID-19 or post-lockdown to make up for those, for the lack in potentially, or gaps potentially in legislation?
That's an interesting one, and I don't know that I'm actually exactly answering your question, but I mean, I think what it has brought to the fore is that, you know, we know the parlous state that our economy's been in the last number of years, but it's scary to see that in the face of adversity like this, that things actually get done, that there's tents for homeless people, and that you know, suddenly you get, you know, business and government working in very much going in the same direction to try to achieve certain things. You see the fiber companies, you know, increasing the flow of data in your house, and you see the price of data, although that was a process that was already started in motion with the Competition Commission. You see MTN bringing down data bundle prices, etc. So, you know, things that come, you know, whether it's on the government side or in the private sector side, there's things that we've been all hearing that can't be done, won't be done, we don't have money for it, etc., etc. So it'll be interesting to see if the types of initiatives that are happening now, whether it's through legislation or otherwise, carry forward post-lockdown, because we've seen actually what the country is capable of doing, even in the state that it is economically.
I certainly like that answer. Thank you very much, Altair. Lydia, any closing comments from you and the team?
So just to say thank you very much to everyone that joined today, and a reminder that the link to all of the regulations as they are released is on our website. We're also doing summaries of the regulations, so you don't have to read the whole 10 pages of it. An easy summary that you can follow very simply is on there, and we're also uploading all of the opinions, etc., that we do on a general basis. So we're not putting up opinions we're giving to specific clients and specific issues, but where we're writing articles and doing general opinions, you'll be able to find that on our website as well. And obviously we're still open, and we're all working from home very well, as you can see. So if anyone has any specific things they'd like to pick up with any of us afterwards, they're more than welcome to.
Thank you so much for that, Lydia. I want to thank each one of you, Pippa, Lydia, Altair, for your time this morning. We really enjoyed having you, and thank you for providing some clarity on some of the more difficult terms to navigate around these regulations which have come through so recently and so quickly upon us. We'll be doing another webinar on Thursday, so please join us again at 4 o'clock on Thursday. Thank you everybody for joining. Have a great day.